Welcome to Stories from the Teacher's Desk. This is where educators connect, share, and grow.
In each episode, we share inspiring stories, practical strategies, and innovative solutions to empower teachers and transform classrooms around the world.
Strengthening scientific understanding through targeted English lessons. And our goal is to extract the core knowledge, really understand what it tells us about effective learning.
Yeah, that's right. Think of this as your personal shortcut to understanding some really interesting work happening in education. This particular paper comes from Tamara Jumabayeva and Almagul Abdikadirkizi at Quantum STEM School in Astana, Kazakhstan.
Okay.
And it looks at a very practical question. How can we help young students grasp science better by being more, intentional about the language we use in the classroom?
So to really understand this paper, let's set the scene. Where did this research actually take place?
Yeah.
And who was involved?
Right. So the study was conducted in a pretty unique setting, a private STEM school in Kazakhstan. And get this, they teach all their STEM subjects, science, tech, engineering, maths, in English right from the first grade.
Wow, from grade 1.
Yeah. They follow a blend of the Kazakh and Cambridge curricula, and they even bring in teaching methods from Singapore. So you can immediately see these are students learning complex stuff in a second language, like really early on.
And who are the key players in this study itself?
The research focused on 100 grade 4 students, so around 9 or 10 years old. And it involved 2 teachers, the science teacher and the English as a foreign language, the EFL teacher. This collaboration aspect between the subject teacher and the language specialist is really, really central to what they were exploring here.
Now, every good piece of research starts with a question or, a hunch. What were the authors trying to figure out?
Well, their main idea, their hypothesis, was basically that if the English teacher provided targeted language support that directly related to what students were learning in science, it would actually improve the students' understanding of the science concepts themselves.
Makes sense.
And they were also looking at how this kind of collaboration, between the teachers could benefit their future teaching practices.
It sounds like they were trying to address a real-world problem they were actually seeing in their classrooms.
Yeah.
What was the driving force, the motivation behind this?
Absolutely. The school had noticed a challenge. How do you really engage young learners with STEM subjects when they're being taught in English? They had students with a huge range of English abilities.
Right.
Some kids might get the science ideas if explained in their first language, but just didn't have the English words to talk about them. Others might have, pretty good English skills, but struggled to apply that language to understand the tricky scientific concepts. They really wanted to find ways to make learning more effective and, equitable for all these different learners.
That makes perfect sense. It's like trying to build a house, but some of the key tools are missing.
Exactly. And the school administration had even observed that the way they were currently teaching wasn't always, connecting the dots between the STEM content and the necessary language skills. For instance, they found students were expected to use things like comparative adjectives in science before they'd even learned those grammar rules in their English classes.
Oh, interesting.
So that lack of coordination was a key motivator for exploring a more integrated approach.
So what was the solution they decided to put to the test in this study then?
They implemented a model called lesson study, which they combined with CLIL, that's content and language integrated learning. Now, CLIL essentially means teaching a subject like science through a foreign language while also paying attention to the language itself.
Okay.
They specifically used a mix of what's called soft CLIL, where English is taught through the science content, focusing on the language demands, and hard CLIL, where science is taught in English, but with deliberate language support built in.
Right.
Their aim was really to see if this integrated approach could boost both the students' understanding of science and their ability to think critically by improving their English communication skills related to science.
Okay, so they had this integrated approach in mind. What was the specific question they were trying to answer with their research to sort of explain this paper mission we're on?
Yeah, the central research question was super focused. How can we teach scientific concepts more effectively by integrating language support into English lessons? That really gets to the heart of it, how to make that crucial link between language and content work best in the classroom.
And to explore this, they zoomed in on a few specific science concepts, right? And what were the main topics of the lessons they studied?
So the 3 research lessons they did, they focused on helping students understand key science concepts, specifically by giving linguistic support within their English lessons. They picked this approach because they'd noticed students were finding it particularly tough in the hard CLIL subject where science was taught only in English.
Oh, okay.
It seemed like their English skills weren't always strong enough to fully grasp the science ideas, which then made it harder for them to, think critically about those topics.
And to really dig deep into how this was working for different students, they used case studies. Tell us about why they focused on individual learners.
Yeah, they strategically picked 3 case study students. These kids represented different learning profiles, varying strengths and needs in both language and science.
Huh.
The idea was to get a more nuanced picture, understand how the integrated approach was affecting different types of learners, so the findings weren't just averages, but reflected real individual experiences.
Let's meet these students then. Who is case student 1?
Okay, case student 1 was identified as a language learner. This 9-year-old student actually showed a good grasp of science concepts when taught in their first language, but their English proficiency was below average, and they really struggled to express their understanding in English, especially like speaking out loud.
Right.
This student really highlighted that common problem, knowing the stuff but lacking the language to show it.
And what about case student 2? What were their characteristics?
Case student 2, also 9 years old, was described as a struggling learner. This student faced difficulties in, both language and STEM subjects. They also had low confidence, tended to be hesitant to join in activities, so they were dealing with a double whammy, struggling with both the language and the subject matter.
And finally, case student 3.
Case student 3 was a 10-year-old considered a high achiever. They had above-average language skills, doing well in STEM, very active, engaged in lessons. This student represented those who were already doing fine, but could potentially benefit from, deeper learning and more complex challenges.
Okay, so with these 3 diverse learners in mind, the teachers designed 3 research lessons. Let's start with the first one. What was the main goal of research lesson 1?
Research lesson 1 was all about building a solid foundation of scientific vocabulary. The aim was to introduce and reinforce key words students needed for scientific inquiry like observe, describe, compare, record. And to help with this, they used visuals, including this poster they'd made with these basic vocab words and pictures. The key insight here for someone looking to improve understanding is the power of explicitly teaching the language alongside the concept, right? Not just expecting kids to absorb it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So how did they make sure the students were actively using this new vocabulary?
They created activities where students had to use these words in meaningful ways. Like they had students observe and then describe natural objects, leaves, rocks, flowers using the new words.
Right.
And to deal with the different English levels, they grouped students based on proficiency. This let them give differentiated support. Stronger students were pushed to use more complex sentences, while those needing more help got sentence starters like, I observe that, or when I compare, I notice, and guided prompts.
And what did they anticipate seeing from their 3 case study students during this vocabulary lesson? What were the predictions?
Okay, so for the language learner, they predicted some initial difficulty, remembering and pronouncing the new words, but they expected them to start using them correctly with support during the guided parts, and eventually use maybe 3 target words in simple sentences with prompting. For the struggling learner, the prediction was tougher. They thought this student would find it challenging to understand and remember words, even with visuals, needing lots of individual attention. They hoped for maybe a slight improvement with hands-on stuff, with the student possibly recognizing and using a couple of new words in structured situations by the end.
And a high achiever.
For the high achiever, the expectation was they'd grasp and use the vocabulary quickly, put it into more complex sentences, and potentially even exceed expectations by using the words in detailed descriptions.
And what did they actually observe in the classroom? Were their predictions on track?
Pretty much. For the language learner, there was that initial hesitation, some pronunciation errors, but the visuals were definitely helpful. By the end, this student was using words like observe and measure in simple sentences when the teacher helped.
Good.
The struggling learner did find it hard, even with the pictures, but a hands-on activity where they described a plant with a partner, that helped them use the word compare in context.
The peer interaction helped.
Exactly. And the high achiever, just as predicted, picked up the vocabulary fast, used it well in speaking and writing, even helped classmates. So that first lesson really showed the power of visuals and targeted vocab instruction, especially when you tailor it to different English levels, right?
Definitely.
Yeah.
So what was the focus of the second research lesson?
Research lesson 2 shifted gears to grammar, specifically the present simple tense. But And this is crucial. They taught it within the science context of forces and movement.
Okay, how did they do that?
The aim was to help students use the present simple to describe scientific facts and general truth, like gravity pulls objects down, or a rolling ball moves.
So how did they integrate the grammar into the science topic?
They used what's called a guided discovery approach. So instead of just listing grammar rules, they introduced the present simple through examples related to forces and movement. They used visuals, real-life demos, hands-on activities to make it more concrete.
Right.
For students needing extra support, they provided sentence starters like gravity objects and word banks. More confident learners were challenged to explain different force-related things using the present simple in their own words. They even touched upon language acquisition theories, noting that putting grammar in meaningful contexts helps students internalize and use it more naturally.
Okay. What were their predictions for the case study students in this grammar-focused lesson?
For the language learner, they thought there'd be initial struggles with subject-verb agreement, tense usage, relying heavily on visuals and teacher examples. They hoped the student would start using regular verbs correctly and maybe make 3 simple present simple sentences with correct agreement by the end.
A struggling learner.
They predicted difficulty forming correct sentences, uncertainty about subject-verb agreement, needing frequent reminders. They hoped for improvement with guided practice, maybe forming a few simple sentences by the end, but likely struggling with more complex stuff.
And the high achiever, presumably expected to fly.
Yep. Expected to quickly understand and use the present simple correctly, put science vocab into longer sentences, maybe exceed expectations by using it in detailed descriptions of forces and movement.
So what were the actual observations during this grammar lesson?
For the language learner, yeah, there was that initial difficulty with subject-verb agreement, but the visuals and repeated examples from the teacher really helped. By the end, the student could form simple sentences like, the ball rolls correctly. The struggling learner still found it tricky to use the present simple independently. But with targeted support during activities where they described movement, they could produce sentences like, the car moves, or gravity pulls.
Okay, progress.
Definitely. And the high achiever, again, grasped it quickly, used it confidently in more complex sentences, even explained grammar points to their peers. And this success, using the present simple in a science context, it really starts to answer that core question, doesn't it? How language support can make science concepts more accessible.
Absolutely. It shows how language isn't just a separate subject, but a tool for understanding everything else.
Okay.
What about the third and final research lesson?
Research Lesson 3 focused on integrating literacy skills with science. Specifically, recognizing and applying cause and effect relationships, both in reading and in scientific reasoning. The authors noted that young learners often find it tricky to connect ideas logically, so explicitly teaching cause and effect can boost both reading comprehension and scientific thinking.
Interesting. What was the main activity for this lesson?
The central task was a cool collaborative project. Students worked in small groups to create a community map. They had to illustrate and label different examples of forces they might see every day, like a car stopping due to friction, or a swing moving because someone pushed it.
How do they organize the students for this collaborative task? Did they group them?
Yeah, they used heterogeneous grouping. That means they mixed students with different academic abilities and English levels in each group.
Ah.
This was based on the idea that kids often learn effectively in social settings, learning from each other. More confident students could lead, explain things, while struggling students could get informal support from their peers.
That makes sense.
They also made sure students used the present simple tense they'd practiced in the last lesson in their descriptions on the map. Things like, the wind pushes the leaves, or friction stops the bicycle. Plus, they had students read a passage from their science textbook first to identify key info about different forces before starting their maps.
Okay. What were their predictions for how the case study students would handle understanding cause and effect in this lesson?
For the language learner, they thought there'd be initial difficulty identifying cause and effect without clear guidance, but expected improvement working with a partner or using sentence starters. They hoped by the end, the student could identify most cause and effect relationships in a short text related to their map.
And the struggling learner.
They predicted challenges with reading comprehension and understanding the key terms about forces, needing significant teacher support. They hoped for some improvement with guided practice on the map, maybe partially grasping the concept with scaffolding, but still needing extra help.
And the high achiever.
Expected to quickly identify cause and effect in the reading and apply it independently to their map, showing strong understanding by explaining it to peers, maybe even creating original cause and effect sentences about forces. They even thought the student might exceed expectations by finding more nuanced relationships and using new vocab in their explanations.
So what did they actually observe when the students worked on their community maps and discussed cause and effect?
Well, the language learner did initially struggle to grasp the cause and effect links, like why friction slows a car. They needed teacher guidance and the visual prompts on the map. But working with a partner and using sentence starters like the cause is because the effect is really helped. By the end, they could match basic forces to real-world situations, though maybe needed a bit more time to fully explain why.
Okay.
The struggling learner also had difficulty with the reading part and connecting forces to outcomes on the map. Needed a lot of support from the teacher and their group. With that help, they could identify some basic pairs, like the ball falls because of gravity, but still needed prompts. The high achiever, though, quickly understood and explained cause and effect independently, applied it well to the map, explained their reasoning to others, even came up with extra examples. So that heterogeneous grouping was really important here. It lines up with Vygotsky's sociocultural theory, basically. Students learn best working together, learning from each other. Explains why that collaborative map activity was so valuable.
What did the students themselves say about this lesson on cause and effect? Any interesting feedback?
Yeah, the language learner mentioned they now felt like they could explain why things happen, like why their bike slows down when they brake. The struggling learner appreciated the help from their group partners and the teachers guiding questions. And the high achiever found the group discussions really useful for sharing different ideas and hearing other perspectives.
So that feedback really highlights the value of visuals, group work, and real-life connections.
Exactly.
Okay, looking at these three research lessons as a whole, what were the overall key findings that emerged from this study? What's the big picture?
The overarching finding was really clear. Explicitly integrating language instruction that's directly linked to the science content significantly improves students' understanding of those science concepts, especially things like forces and movement.
Right.
They saw that language learners really benefited from visuals and hands-on activities that helped bridge the gap between new English words and abstract science ideas. Struggling learners showed progress, though they still needed more ongoing support. And high-achieving students, they readily picked up the language and grammar and applied it effectively.
So based on that, did the teachers plan any changes?
Yeah, based on these findings, the teachers plan to incorporate more interactive and visual elements into future lessons, provide more challenging tasks for high achievers, and generally adopt a more differentiated approach to cater to everyone's needs. And they also really emphasized the huge value they saw in collaborative learning among the students.
They also looked at student assessments before and after these research lessons, didn't they? What did those results show?
Yes, they compared the number of students meeting, exceeding, or still needing support on the learning objectives before and after the lesson study. And the results were very positive.
How positive?
After the lessons, they saw 4 more students meeting the goals and 2 more exceeding them. And crucially, the number of students needing significant support went down by 6.
Wow, that's a noticeable shift.
It really is. It strongly suggests their integrated teaching approach was more effective than what they were doing before. They even noted their initial predictions were a bit conservative. The actual improvements were even bigger than they expected.
It sounds like they developed some specific teaching resources and strategies during this study, too. Can you tell us a bit more about those?
Yeah, one key thing was a customized visual vocabulary toolkit for science. This had flashcards, interactive digital slides, even physical manipulatives for concepts like force, motion, push, pull.
Making it concrete.
Exactly. Making abstract terms more accessible, especially for students still developing their English. They also used structured sentence frames, a lot like when I push the object, it moves because, and graphic organizers to help students structure their thinking and explain their reasoning in English.
Were there any particular quotes from the students or teachers that really stood out, illustrating the impact?
Oh, definitely. Some were very insightful. The language learner said, "It's easier when I can see pictures of what the words mean. I remember better when I can say the sentence after the teacher."
That's clear feedback.
And the struggling learner's comment was quite moving. "I didn't know I could talk about science in English. I felt smart when I told my partner what I saw."
Wow, that's powerful.
Isn't it? And the high achiever shared, I liked helping my classmates and using the new words in my story about forces. It made science fun.
And from the teachers.
The EFL teacher noted, students were much more engaged when they were using scientific concepts as a way to explore grammar. Applying language structures in a real, meaningful context helped them see grammar as a tool, not just rules. And the science teacher said, after the English teacher provided the necessary language support beforehand, my students were much more confident expressing their scientific ideas. This allowed us to delve deeper into the science itself without getting bogged down by language barriers.
It sounds like this research experience really prompted some significant changes in their teaching practices then. What were some of the key adjustments they implemented afterwards?
Following the study, they made a conscious effort to use visual and kinesthetic supports much more regularly, more hands-on stuff, real-life examples. Peer collaboration became more central, often pairing struggling students with supportive classmates. They refined their sentence frames too, making them fit specific tasks better and provide the right level of scaffolding.
And they saw results from these changes.
Definitely. They observed increased student confidence in using English for science, and even students who'd previously struggled showed better understanding. The biggest shift was that intentional, consistent integration of language and science. It helped students connect the two naturally and deepened their overall comprehension.
What were some of the key successes they experienced during this lesson study? And conversely, what challenges did they encounter?
A major success was the unexpected progress in some struggling students, especially through collaboration. But they faced hurdles too. Pacing was sometimes an issue, activities taking longer than planned.
Yeah, that happens.
And they highlighted the significant time needed to prepare these integrated lessons and the difficulty of balancing both language and science content effectively in one lesson. They reflected that maybe a more thorough initial assessment of English skills would have helped, and designing activities even more precisely tailored to language levels.
So what's their advice for others?
Their recommendation is maintain flexibility in lesson plans and actively use student feedback to improve. Ultimately, they felt the study really underlined the power of connecting subjects and seeing language as a fundamental tool for learning everything else.
It sounds like they were keen to share what they learned. How did they make their findings public?
They were definitely eager. Within their school, they presented at professional development days. Temura Jumabayeva actually led a workshop at the Walls World Association of Lesson Studies conference, sharing their approach.
Oh, nice. Wider audience.
Yeah. And they plan to publish in the Camtree Digital Library and the Walls Journal, making it accessible to more educators and researchers. They've even started a new action research project building on this, focusing on culturally relevant CLIL.
Culturally relevant CLIL. Interesting.
Yeah. And for anyone wanting to replicate this, their key advice is clear communication and collaboration between teachers, truly integrated lessons, flexibility, encourage student collaboration, and always value student feedback.
So what are the next steps for these researchers building on this study?
While continuing to explore interdisciplinary approaches, especially with that new project on culturally relevant CLRL, looking at how to connect STEM to students' cultural backgrounds and languages, they also plan to refine and expand the resources they developed, the sentence frames, visuals hoping to create a repository for other educators.
This deep dive into the research on strengthening scientific understanding through targeted English lessons really does highlight exciting possibilities when educators collaborate and focus on language in all learning. So, for you, what's the most significant insight someone listening should take away from this? Explain this paper deep dive.
For me, the biggest thing is the profound impact that intentional, targeted language support can have on students' ability to understand complex STEM concepts, especially young learners. It's not just about teaching science and English, it's about actively teaching the language of science, the specific vocab, the grammar used to explain things, how scientific arguments work. This study just powerfully shows that when you deliberately integrate language instruction with the science content, you can unlock deeper understanding and engagement for a much wider range of students. It makes a real difference.
That's such a crucial point. And it really makes you think, doesn't it, about any subject or skill you might find challenging. Could focusing more on the language of that area, the specific words, how concepts are structured and talked about, be the key to unlocking deeper comprehension and making it, well, more accessible?
Exactly. This research kind of pushes us to consider the often overlooked language demands in all areas of learning. By making those demands explicit and providing targeted support, we can empower learners not just to understand new information, but also to communicate that understanding effectively. We really hope this deep dive into this fascinating study has given you some valuable insights to consider in your own learning journey.
Thanks for listening.
If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend and stay tuned for the next one.